No one knew his name. He was just known as the homeless man outside the base. Every day, in rain, snow, or sunshine, he sat there. Some soldiers would give him food, others would ignore him. Years passed, commanders changed, but he remained. No one ever asked why he was there. Until one winter morning, when newly assigned General Scott stepped out of his car and walked directly toward him. As all base personnel watched in astonishment, the general stood before the homeless man and raised his hand to his forehead. Welcome to the human stories. Before we continue, share in the comments which city you're watching from. And if you believe stories like these need to be heard, subscribe to help keep these voices alive. Just outside the main gate of Fort Bragg, in the corner by the wall, there was a cardboard box covered with a tarp. That cardboard box had been there for 10 years, just like the man who sat beside it. In winter, he would sleep inside the box. In summer, he would sit on a worn blanket under a tree. Every morning at exactly 0600 hours, he would wake up, straighten himself, and go sit in the corner to the left of the base's main entrance. It was hard to guess his age, maybe in his 60s, maybe 70s. His gray beard was thin but well kept. His clothes were old but clean. He always wore the same things, a green jacket, brown pants, and a pair of black boots. Though worn, his boots always seemed polished. Among the base personnel, he was something of a small legend. Some thought he was a former soldier, others believed he was an engineer who had lost his sanity, and some simply thought he was a homeless man who wanted to be close to the base. But no one ever really asked him who he was. Captain Mitchell had seen him every morning on his way to work for 8 years. In the beginning, he would bring him coffee and a sandwich. The man would always thank him, but rarely speak. Mitchell eventually got used to his presence, but he never quite knew what to make of him. "He's there again," Mitchell said as he parked his car. The young lieutenant sitting next to him didn't understand what the captain was referring to. "Who, sir?" "The gatekeeper, the man outside the base. Lieutenant Thompson had only been assigned to Fort Bragg 3 weeks ago." He looked out the car window and saw the old man sitting at the base's gate. "Is he homeless?" Mitchell sighed as he parked his car. "Nobody really knows. He's been here for 8 years, every day. Never begs for anything, never causes trouble. He just sits." "Why doesn't anyone help him?" Thompson asked. "We've tried. Offered to take him to a shelter. He refused. Gave him money. He wouldn't take it. If you bring food, he'll accept it. Say thank you, but that's it. When Captain Yates gave him a blanket once, the man's eyes watered. That's the only emotional response I've seen from him in years." The two soldiers got out of the car. Lieutenant Thompson paused to look toward where the old man was sitting. The man sat quietly, with empty eyes looking into the base, his hands folded in his lap, back straight, just sitting. "Have you ever asked him who he is?" Mitchell paused. "Number, I never have." This answer surprised even Mitchell himself. Why had he never asked this man who he was after seeing him every day for 8 years? That day, there was unusual activity on the base. Preparations were being made for the arrival of the new commander, General Scott. General Scott was one of the country's most respected military leaders. He had served in Afghanistan, earned multiple medals, and was known for his strategic genius. In the afternoon, all personnel lined up at the base entrance for the welcoming ceremony. Everyone was in uniform, standing in formation. Lieutenant Thompson and Captain Mitchell were also waiting with the others. The old homeless man sat in his usual corner, watching what was happening. At exactly 1400 hours, a convoy consisting of 3 cars and an escort approached the base gate. Everyone stood at attention. A uniformed driver got out of the middle black vehicle and opened the back door. General Scott emerged from the vehicle in full uniform. The general was in his early 60s, a strongly built man. His sharp gaze and determined posture stood out. Colonel Wilson, the base commander, stepped forward and saluted. "Welcome, General." General Scott returned the salute and began looking around. His eyes scanned the soldiers lined up at the base entrance, then fixed on the old man sitting just outside the gate. Everyone expected the general to salute the soldiers and enter, but General Scott, unexpectedly, began walking directly toward the old man sitting by the gate instead of heading straight into the base. Colonel Wilson looked at the general in surprise but couldn't say anything. All the soldiers and personnel watched curiously to see what the general would do. General Scott stood in front of the old man. The man didn't get up. He just looked up. They stared at each other for a moment. Then, something unexpected happened. General Scott straightened his back and gave the old homeless man a full military salute. As all base personnel watched in shock, the old man slowly stood up. His posture had changed. His back straightened, his shoulders tensed, his chin lifted slightly. The emptiness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp gaze. And then he saluted the general back. A perfect, flawless military salute. The two men remained saluting each other for a few seconds. Then General Scott lowered his hand and spoke. "Colonel Hayes, it's an honor to see you again." The old man slowly lowered his hand. "General, welcome." Colonel Wilson and the other base personnel were in shock. No one understood what was happening. Captain Mitchell and Lieutenant Thompson also exchanged astonished looks. General Scott approached the old man, Colonel Hayes, and extended his hand. "How long has it been, Thomas?" 20 years. Colonel Hayes nodded. 22 years, 4 months, 18 days. The general smiled. "You're still counting." "Every day." The general looked around, then turned back to Colonel Hayes. "Why are you here?" Colonel Hayes looked toward the base gate. "I'm on duty." General Scott paused for a moment, then his eyes slightly watered. "The duty is over, Thomas." "It ended a long time ago." Colonel Hayes shook his head. "No, General, it's not over until they all come back." At these words, the expression on General Scott's face changed. He understood. He slightly bowed his head and remained silent for a while. Then, he slowly put his hand on Colonel Hayes' shoulder. "Come with me, Thomas. We have a lot to talk about." Colonel Hayes hesitated for a moment, then nodded. General Scott began walking toward the base gate with the old man. All personnel watched them in amazement. Colonel Wilson quickly approached the general. "General, what's going on?" "Who is this man?" General Scott gave Colonel Wilson a serious look. "This man is Colonel Thomas Hayes, and he's one of the bravest soldiers in the history of this base." Colonel Wilson's face froze in surprise. "Colonel Hayes? But he's—" "Yes," said General Scott. "He's the Colonel Thomas Hayes who was reported missing 10 years ago after saving 18 soldiers in the IED attack in Fallujah and then disappearing." A tense silence filled the conference room at the base. Seated around a table were General Scott, Colonel Wilson, Captain Mitchell, and Colonel Hayes. Lieutenant Thompson stood by the door. Colonel Hayes had placed his hands on the table. Despite living in the sun and cold for years, his hands were still a soldier's hands, strong, determined, and steady. 10 years ago, we lost 23 soldiers in the terrorist attack in Fallujah, began General Scott. 18 soldiers were saved, 5 were missing. Colonel Hayes led the rescue operation. After the explosion, he went in again and again to pull out soldiers trapped under the rubble. After getting the last soldier out, there was a second explosion. Colonel Hayes's body was never found. He was declared missing, but officially presumed dead. Colonel Wilson looked at Colonel Hayes, struggling to believe. "But how? Why didn't you tell anyone? Your family? Everyone thought you were dead." Colonel Hayes looked at the table, then slowly raised his head. "After the second explosion, I lost my memory. For months I didn't know who I was. I walked from east to west. One day, I found myself outside this base. Something drew me here. And then, I started to remember." "What did you remember?" asked Captain Mitchell. "Names," said Colonel Hayes. Faces. The names and faces of my missing soldiers. 5 of my men are still there under the rubble. I left them behind. General Scott leaned forward. Thomas, you couldn't have saved them. When the second explosion happened, the building completely collapsed. You were nearly killed yourself. A commander doesn't leave his soldiers behind, said Colonel Hayes, his voice slightly trembling. I promised them. I promised I would bring them all home. Everyone in the room fell silent. General Scott held Colonel Hayes' hand. Is that why you sat here, at the base gate? Were you waiting for them? Colonel Hayes nodded. Every day I count each of their names. Captain William Stevens, Lieutenant John Reese, Sergeant Marcus Williams, Private Nathan Cooper, Private Samuel Lewis. They will come back, and I will be here. I will welcome them. Tears were flowing from everyone's eyes. Even Lieutenant Thompson couldn't hold back his tears. Captain Mitchell flinched when he heard the sergeant's name mentioned by Colonel Hayes. There was no relation, but he still felt a strange connection. General Scott took a deep breath. Thomas, they're not coming back. You know that. I know, said Colonel Hayes, his voice now stronger. But I promised, and a soldier keeps his word. General Scott thought for a moment, then turned to Colonel Wilson. Colonel, check our records. I want to know the status of the 5 soldiers missing in the Fallujah incident. Maybe we can bring them home. Colonel Wilson nodded and quickly left the room. The general turned back to Colonel Hayes. Thomas, we thought you were dead. Your wife? Your children? Colonel Hayes's face momentarily contorted with pain. What happened to them? Your wife Claire passed away 3 years ago. Your daughter Sarah became a doctor in Baltimore. Your son Matthew, he also became a soldier, Thomas. He's now a captain. Colonel Hayes's eyes filled with tears. Sarah, Matthew, they were just children when I last saw them. General Scott firmly held his old friend's hand. We'll help you, Thomas. You'll go home. But first, you need to find yourself. You've been missing for 10 years. You've been sitting at this base gate for 10 years. Why didn't you ever tell anyone who you were? Colonel Hayes remained silent for a long time. Then, because I'm not that man anymore, he said. I'm not Colonel Thomas Hayes anymore. I'm a man who made a promise he couldn't keep. Captain Mitchell stood up from the table and looked directly into Colonel Hayes's eyes. No, sir. You kept your promise. For 10 years, every day, in rain, snow, and sunshine, you sat there. You waited for them. What more could a soldier do? Colonel Hayes blinked, as if considering this perspective for the first time. 2 days later, a small ceremony was held in front of the main gate of the military base. Colonel Hayes was wearing a clean uniform. His hair and beard had been cut, and for the first time in years, he looked like a soldier. Beside him stood General Scott, Colonel Wilson, Captain Mitchell, and Lieutenant Thompson. Colonel Wilson saw a military convoy approaching carrying 5 caskets. The convoy stopped in front of the base. 5 caskets, covered with American flags, were slowly unloaded from the vehicles. 10 years after the Fallujah attack, the remains of our 5 missing soldiers have finally been found, said Colonel Wilson. A special team conducting research deep in the rubble found them. They're coming home, Colonel. Colonel Hayes trembled when he saw the 5 caskets. He stepped forward heavily and stood before each one. He touched each casket, placed his hand on each flag-draped cover. Captain William Stevens, he said as he stood in front of the first casket. Lieutenant John Reese, he said, touching the second. Sergeant Marcus Williams. Private Nathan Cooper, Private Samuel Lewis. As he spoke each name, a memory, a story passed across his face. When he stood before the last casket, he gave a sharp military salute. Mission accomplished, my soldiers. You've all come home. All base personnel couldn't hold back their tears as they watched this emotional moment. Colonel Hayes looked at the 5 caskets one last time, then turned to General Scott. I'm ready to go home too, General. That evening, Colonel Hayes's story spread rapidly. The news that the homeless man, who'd been sitting at the base gate for years, was actually a missing hero, waiting for his soldiers, spread throughout the country. Television, newspapers, social media were all talking about his story. A week later, another welcoming ceremony was held at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. Colonel Hayes disembarked from the plane with General Scott. Among the crowd filling the tarmac, two people stepped forward, a woman in her 30s and a young man in uniform. "Dad?" said the woman in tears. Colonel Hayes froze when he saw his daughter Sarah. The young man beside her was his son, Captain Matthew Hayes. Both looked at him as if they couldn't believe he was their father. "Sarah. Matthew," whispered Colonel Hayes. The three ran to each other and embraced tightly. A father who had been missing for years had been reunited with his grown children. Everyone watching this emotional moment couldn't hold back their tears. "Dad, we thought we lost you," said Sarah, sobbing. "I thought so too, sweetheart," said Colonel Hayes, looking at his children's faces. "But I made a promise, and a soldier always keeps his word." Matthew looked at his father's uniform, at the medals on his chest, at his rank. "I became a soldier to be like you, Dad. Your stories, your courage inspired me." Colonel Hayes looked at his son's uniform, at the captain's rank on his shoulder. He smiled with pride. "You're already better than me, son." General Scott watched this family reunion from a distance, his eyes moist. He turned to Captain Mitchell standing beside him. "A soldier never gives up. That's why we wear this uniform." Captain Mitchell nodded. "Yes, General. And now I've learned the truth about the man I passed by every day for 8 years. I have a lot to learn from him." 2 weeks later, Colonel Hayes came to visit his old base to say goodbye. He now looked completely different, clean-shaven, well-dressed. His son, Captain Matthew Hayes, was with him. When he arrived at the base gate, all personnel had lined up to greet him. Everyone stood at attention. Colonel Hayes looked at the corner where he had sat for so long. A new monument had been erected there, a small stone monument with the names of the 5 soldiers inscribed on it. Colonel Hayes approached the monument and placed his hand on the stone. The names were still in his mind, the faces still in his memories, but he was at peace now. He had completed his mission. Captain Mitchell and Lieutenant Thompson approached him. "It will be strange not seeing you here every morning, sir," said Mitchell. Colonel Hayes smiled. "I have a new mission now, Captain. To make up for lost time, to get to know my children, and perhaps to tell my story." Lieutenant Thompson asked curiously, "Your story, sir?" "Yes, young man. Sometimes the quietest people have the most powerful stories to tell. And sometimes the most invisible people are the ones who have done the most heroic deeds." As Colonel Hayes left the base with his son, he looked at the monument by the gate one last time. He was going home now. Truly home. That day, the corner outside the military base gate remained empty. But his story continued to live in the hearts of all base personnel of the entire country. No one knew his name until a general saluted him. And that salute changed a man's life, a family's fate, and a nation's memory. Now I want to ask you, have you ever known a hero in your life that you passed by every day but never noticed? Maybe a neighbor, maybe a teacher, maybe a stranger on the street. No one asked them who they were, but perhaps they are the ones with the most extraordinary stories. Share in the comments, and let's keep the stories of these forgotten heroes alive. This was Unseen Valor. Subscribe to help make sure stories like these are heard.